Hello. Today we're going to talk about organizational design. We're going to look at some of the reasons why you make the decisions that you make and the implications of some of those organizational structure decisions. Now, ultimately, organizational design decisions that you make are about getting things done. So, who does what? And the decisions that you make have to do with coordination and load sharing and a variety of different elements to that. Uh, at the same time, the structure that you put in place will have very decided cultural influences within an organization. So ultimately, how you're going to make your decisions kind of comes down to there's some fairly significant pieces that kind of drive the decision making. One of them has to do with the complexity of what's required for the business. One of the first cuts that you usually make into like multiple different jobs is functional, right? So I'll sell, you'll build stuff, somebody else will do the accounting, that's usually the first cuts that you make are usually functional ones. As the organization grows and you can't have one person do the function anymore, or if it's a situation where like a retail store or restaurant where like the number of hours that you're open is just beyond what any one person would work, you have to have multiple people in that department. And then once you have multiple people in that department, there becomes a requirement for some supervisory or management level and so on and so forth. And it kind of builds from there. Another aspect has to do with the formalization of the organization of the industry. Again, a corner restaurant, not a fairly formal organization. A law firm, more formalized, right? So some of it has to do with the space that you're in, and then ultimately, this concept of centralization, decentralization isn't a structure per se, right? So what it is it's all about how a business makes decisions, where they're made, who makes them. Nobody lives at either end. There's not 100% centralized and there's not 100% decentralized, right? Everybody's somewhere along the continuum. It's just how much are you one direction or another, okay? Centralization, one or very few people make pretty much all the decisions. Decentralized, more people share in the decision-making of an organization. And kind of the structural choices that you make will tend to lend itself more in one direction or another. And we'll look at that in a moment. So purposes of your design that you come up with, as I said before, it's about getting stuff done, right? It's about allocating resources, tasks and responsibility, dividing the total work up. The choices that you make will have implications on how well you inherently can coordinate. For that reason, one of the things that you see happen, one of the things you see happen these days is there's a greater tendency towards flatter organizations because it tends to allow for better coordination. You'll also see that organizations today, the roles tend to be bigger with less definition of where they start and end than used to be, certainly in older style industrial organizations. And the positions tend to be a little more enabled, right? So they can make a little bit more decisions about the things that they do. So it's a little more decentralized. And the structure also establishes formal lines of authority. So basically, who's your boss, and whose direction do you follow, and so on and so forth. So you have vertical elements, right, which is the depth that you get. And as the example I gave before, usually you start functionally, and then as you need more people in that functional area, you got to figure out a way to coordinate the people that are in that area, which usually drives the need for supervisory management levels, so on and so forth. And then your horizontal is your breadth. Older style early industrial organizations, not as much horizontal as vertical, certainly a fairly strong vertical emphasis, and historical organizational structures and ideas that originally came out of military requirements, pre-industrial revolution, kind of held through, and they tended to be very vertically organized organizations. Over time, what we've seen is there's been a move to flatten and enable and shift some of the decision-making ability more and more to a variety of roles throughout the organization. And that has implications, right, on your decision-making structure, right? So are we more centralized or are we more decentralized? One of the key elements of any kind of vertical parts of the org design is this concept of unity command, right? Which is basically, it should be really, really clear at any point in time, regardless of how deep your vertical structure is, who you work for. Who's your boss? Who do you pay attention to? Who do they pay attention to? So this unity of command and this chain is an important part of the coordination of the structure. Now, inherent in any supervisory or management role are certain rights, right? So they're basically, it's the position, not the person. And you'll see this, and you'll certainly, if you haven't already, you'll feel this firsthand, is that you may well have a boss that has authority, but isn't necessarily a leadership figure and isn't somebody that you would necessarily follow. We'll talk about, the role of leadership in one of the future segments, but authority is about the position, leadership is about the person. Ideally, you want both of them to coordinate over top of each other. That's not really all that common a circumstance, unfortunately. You usually find one without the other. Now, of authority, there's two categories, if you will. So there's line authority, which is about business decisions, right? So, who do we sell to? What do we price it at? Things like that, right? Staff authority is about human resources decisions, right? So, and beyond just who do we hire, but like compensation and benefits and, how much holiday and things like that. What you normally find is line authority is common at the front of the organization and all the way up. Staff authority usually doesn't happen until you're pretty high up in an organization. And even at that point, there are, I guess technically, if you get to the president or the CEO or whatever, technically they could make almost any staff authority decision, but practically they don't. And they don't for very important reasons, is that organizations create a policy, right, which is a set of rules that guide our behaviors with how they compensate and what the patterns are as far as for how they deal with their employees. And you don't want inconsistency in those policies. First of all, it would very, very quickly be learned. And if one area realized that they were at a disadvantage to another, you would have all kinds of internal issues. So there needs to be consistency. And that's one of the reasons why you'll often find the staff authority decisions are relegated to pretty high and senior levels in organizations, so that there's this consistency of approach, right? Whereas line authority, they're making decisions about the area that they're in and the time frame and the requirements of particular customers or in particular regions, or like there's a lot of variability. It's a very dynamic space. The staff authorities thing is a less dynamic, and as I said, there are significant organizational disadvantages to being inconsistent when it comes to your HR decisions. Now, this concept of span of control has to do with how many people can a supervisor or manager adequately support. Generally speaking, in an organization, frontline supervisory positions are capable of supporting more individuals. As you work your way up the organization, your span of control decreases. This will vary pretty significantly depending on the organization, the space that you're in. And there's all kinds of different elements, right? So the complexity of the tasks, the turnover that you have, the culture of the organization, the complexity of the business that you're in. And so there's all kinds of things that affect it. So optimum span of control is very circumstantial. So there isn't a universal that, oh, well, if you're at this level, this is the right thing. It really is driven by the circumstance. And it's one of the things that when organizations do an org change, which is not an uncommon procedure, particularly in larger organizations, they shift the roles and they shift the descriptions of the roles and how they interact with each other. But one of the things that they often deal with is a change in span of control, right? Unfortunately, often span of control isn't done to make it more narrow. It's usually done to make it broader, because that becomes a way of removing management, particularly middle management positions, and just making more people report to that one person. Sometimes you can do it and get away with it, and it doesn't have a negative effect on the ability for the organization to be successful. Often it does, and it's a decision that gets driven by finances more than anything else. Now, your horizontal we talked about is how's the job performed? What do departments do? What do we need from each of the departments? How many people do you need to do these things? Um, what kind of granularity do you need? Um, and are there roles that can be combined? And usually, if you're starting off and you open your own business and it's a single person thing, like you'll do everything very quickly in that process. Usually, they'll hire a bookkeeper, even if it's part time, because most entrepreneurs are not great at keeping track of the finances, like from the accounting standpoint, and don't particularly care to do it. So it's usually one of the first things that they offload to somebody else. And then often what you'll start doing is you'll start bringing other people on to help you in specific areas. And one of the ways you coordinate, you go, hey, you're going to do this and I'm going to do that, right? And as more and more of that happens, you kind of cut those things up finer and finer. That has an implication on your the way as an organization you make decisions, right? So if it's just you, obviously you're making all the decisions. As you hire other people, you can direct them, but that really changes how much you direct them, really potentially changes how they do their job. Or you can, when you bring them on, you can empower them to, handle a specific aspect of the organization, and you can manage their activities through goals and objectives and a variety of other measures that you're using, but let them kind of decide some of the details about how they do things, which is more of your decentralized approach. um, Both situations can work. It really depends on the space, honestly, and the leadership style. I mentioned before, current trends are flatter, um, more decentralization of business decisions. That does allow for better agility, more creativity, better dynamic control. Um, it does tend to be favored more. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the nature of work has changed over the years. And even fairly entry level and fairly basic roles have some cognitive pieces of it. Whereas a lot of the early industrial experience, a lot of workers were essentially machine extensions. So they weren't supposed to necessarily think about the roles they were doing. They were just supposed to do it. Um, and in those circumstances, centralization tends to work a lot better because you're looking for compliance. And that's ultimately, if you want compliance, centralization. If you want engagement, decentralization. And there's roles for either in the world today. Um, there are some organizations that control is really important for consistency. Really big franchise organizations. So McDonald's, for example, there are some elements of the business that the individual franchisees, in the locations have some control over. So much of how they operate their business has been dictated by head office, and they control that very, very strictly, right? What you're serving, where you're ordering it from, what you're pricing it at, how you're laying the location out, how you're staffing it, how you're, like, so many of these things are dictated. And they're done because they're looking for compliance. They're looking for that location to operate exactly like it's supposed to, which is very consistent with all of the others that they have throughout the entire chain, and particularly very consistent within the region. And that's to drive so that the customer experience from one place to another is as consistent and meets the standards of that organization as much as possible. So they're still fairly centralized in the way they approach it. And you'll find in the topic, there's not a good or bad, right? One isn't better than another. It's really driven by the circumstance, right? As I said, generally speaking, if you need compliance, consistency, more centralization is better. If you want engagement, more decentralization tends to be better. So you may prefer, right, going more decentralized. Environment's more complex, which is very true today, right? If you have people that are more capable of decisions, one of the things in early industrial experiences is most people were fairly poorly educated. A lot of people were illiterate. A lot of people weren't in a position where they were going to be any good at making these decisions, which is one of the reasons why they kind of were in these centralized areas. The more the decisions are relatively minor, or what I would refer to as not bet your company decisions. And the truth is, almost every line authority kind of decision that organizations make are relatively minor. Usually, if you get it wrong, the implications are that it costs the organization money. Now, how much money it costs them and other repercussions can be more significant. But usually, most of them, I'm not saying they don't matter because they do, but any one decision on its own doesn't usually have very significant consequences. HR ones could, right? Which is one of the reasons why, like I said before, you find staff authorities usually much higher up the org. Your corporate culture, and we've talked about culture a little bit, and it'll come up again and again. Culture is basically the rules within our organization. It's how we operate. It's what's important to us, what's not, how we interact with each other, how we look at things. Like it governs the behavior of the individuals in the organization. If your culture is about trying to get employees to engage, which most organizations are trying to foster that these days, give them more authority, right? Give them some autonomy in how they do the jobs that they're doing. When you have geographical distance, very, very important, right? So people running a business in Canada versus, the same business that they're trying to run in the UK, for example. They're different markets, they're different areas, there's different, like, you can't, your likelihood of getting it right based on a Canadian frame of mind is probably not all that high, because you need to have people that understand the locality, right? And then it gets even worse when you get into even more differences in cultures and languages and so on and so forth. Now, the structural choices that you choose to make, there's all kinds of different, and this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. There's more details in the textbook that you do need to go through and review. As I said, the first one is usually functional, right? So it's the actual function, so engineering, accounting, so on and so forth. Lots of organizations organize around a product. That's a very, very common approach, right? So if you look at a good example is P&G, so Procter and Gamble, right? Which is a huge consumer brand organization. There's people that work for Tide. There's people that work for, the other products that they have. You often will org around customers, particularly your go-to-market sales and any technical or regional support, because the needs of a government customer are different than a wholesale, than a retail, than any of those other things. So that's a common one. I mentioned before geographic, which is also another very common one, because there are differences from one geography to another. And you need to be able to localize what you're doing in order to be successful. You can do the same thing around a process, around teams. You'll see some matrix structures. Matrix structure is basically where you have roles that kind of exist in two orgs. It's a common thing to do for organizational roles that have no external customers. So accounting usually doesn't have any external customers, they're all internal. HR doesn't have any external customers, they're all internal. One of the ways to glue those people to the parts of the org that they support is to have them live in those teams. And although they're still, for sure, from a unity command standpoint, it's still clear they work for HR, they work for accounting or whatever. Functionally, they do their jobs with that specific team that they're assigned to, and they'll live in the same, like they'll have an office in the same area, they'll cube in the same area, and they're part of that team. And it's a way to bind those kind of supporting roles, if you will, to the functional areas that they're supposed to support. Other factors that you look at based on the kind of org decisions that you make, the strategy of your organization, and we'll do strategic planning, and we'll talk about strategy and stuff in a little bit. The size of the organization, usually the bigger it is, the more specialization that happens, and therefore usually there's more vertical structures. Technology of the business, your core competencies, legal or regulatory requirements for the area that you're in, the level of competition in the industry that you're in, the hard facilities that you may have, whether there's workforce issues, in your particular business, and if there's any various different environmental factors around you that may have a significant effect on the choices that you make.